Chapter 2, Displaying and Describing Data. We're going to start off by summarizing the distribution of a categorical variable. And recall, categorical variables are variables that have some list of categories that each case can be in. So if we look at our data set we were looking at last time, we've got model of cars. So you can see we've got Prius, Camry. So there's several different models that each car may be. All right, so when we want to summarize a categorical variable, such as this, what we need to do is count how many is in each category. So when I'm summarizing categorical variables, it's always going to be counts and proportions, which another word for those are frequencies, which means count, and relative frequency, which means proportion. So we're describing its distribution. What is the distribution of a variable? Well, the distribution of a variable are its values and how often they occur. Okay, so the distribution of model then is going to be each model that's listed here and how many cars are that type of model. So we organize that into what's called a frequency table. So you can see here I have my categorical variable here, which is model. And we're going to summarize that by its frequency of each type of model and its relative frequency. So the frequency is just count. So if we go over here and let me see how many Avalons I have. I got one Avalon in that whole list. So this is going to be 1. How many CRZs do I have? I got 1, 2. So I'm going to write a 2 in here. How many Camrys? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Camrys. And how many Priuses? So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So a lot of Priuses for sale. And the total of those, they better be 20 because there's 20 cars over here. And it is 1 and 2 is 3 and 7 is 10 plus 10 is 20. So that's one way of describing its distribution, is saying that I've got 1 Avalon, 2 CRZs, 7 Camrys, and 10 Priuses for sale. To get the proportion, a proportion in general is a count over a total count. Always. Every proportion is a count over a total count. So the smallest proportion, what's the smallest count that's possible of anything? And that would be 0. So the smallest proportion can be 0. There's no negative proportion. What's the biggest a count can be? Well, if I got a total count here, the count can't be any bigger than that. So the biggest the proportion could be is the total count over the total count. So that would be 1. All right, so it's always going to be between 0 and 1, always. Or 0 and 100%, which is the same thing. All right, so how do we get the relative frequency or the proportion here? So again, it's going to be the count, which we call the frequency, over the total count. All right, so for the first one, for the Avalon, I've got a count of 1 divided by the total count, which is 20. So that is going to be 0.05. And if I want that in percent, I just multiply by 100%, or I move the decimal 2 places, 1 and 2. So this is 5%. So in this relative frequency, I could write either 1 over 20 or 0.05 or 5%, and they would all mean the same thing. All 3 of those numbers are equal to each other. So I'm going to write 5%. Similarly, the proportion of CRZs is 2 over 20, which is 1/10, which is 0.1 or 10%. Camrys, that's going to be 7 over 20. And that happens to be 0.35, which is the same thing as 35%. So this will be 35%. 10 over 20, that's half, so that's 50%. All right. So when I add all these together, what are my relative frequencies going to add to? Before you actually add them, think about that. So if I add all these, they add to 20. So I'm dividing all of these by 20 to get to here. So 20 over 20, that's 1. So when these are all added up, they're going to be 1 or 100%. So the distribution of model, I can either say is 1 Avalon, 2 CRZs, 7 Camrys, and 10 Priuses, or I could say 5% Avalons, 10% CRZs, 35% Camry, and 50% Prius. So there's a lot of Priuses there. And that would be the distribution of model. All right, I got a question for you. Is it appropriate to say the proportion of Camry or Priuses, can I add these together and say 85% of the cars are either Camrys or Priuses? And I'm going to tell you the answer is yes. Counts and proportions are additive. As long as there's no overlap. What I mean by overlap is that there isn't a car that's both a Camry and a Prius. So since there aren't, so adding them together wouldn't be double counting that car. So yes, there's 85% of the cars are Camuses or Priuses.